Welcome back to Judgment Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to begin the discussion of war and peace and traditional routes to thinking about more peaceful activities. The overall chapter goals here include looking at evidence of how our worst behaviors are in retreat and our best behaviors are in the rise. Next, we want to examine ways that we can improve our good behaviors, and is there any physiological evidence from biology that gives us clues on how to do that. And finally, we're going to close with some examples of how our best behaviors can occur in the most unlikely circumstances to kind of give us a roadmap as to how we can actually enact some of the research that we've learned in the book Behave. Now, when it comes to our best and worst behaviors, the world is astonishingly different than the not-so-distant past. Some of the progress is that we no longer have worldwide slavery. This was just back in the 19th century that almost every country had some form of institutional slavery. We now have child labor laws, most places around the world, and there is some variation here, no longer permit young children to work. And early in the 19th century, there was no such thing as the mistreatment of animals. All of these things have advanced. And I will say some of the topics that I'm going to discuss vary from country to country. But if we look at the world as a whole, we see advancements on these domains. The world is also safer. 15th century Europe, on average, there was 41 homicides per 100,000 people every year. Now, there's some countries that haven't had as many improvements in terms of homicide rates, particularly El Salvador has 62, Venezuela 64, and Honduras 85 homicides per 100,000 people. It's actually more. But the worldwide average, again, is 6.9, which is significantly lower. Europe has 1.4 homicides per 100,000 people. And there's some really fantastic examples such as Iceland, Japan, and Singapore that have 0.3% homicides, 0.3 homicides for every 100,000 people. So there's some fantastic examples out there of how we are significantly improving the safety of people around the world. There's also many events that are significantly rarer in recent centuries. There's less forced marriages, child bride, genital mutilation, wife beatings, polygamy, and so on, which is really fantastic. And again, this varies from country to country, but as a whole, we're seeing less of these things occurring around the planet. And there's some new things that have been developed. Now there is, in some places, bans on certain types of weapons. Crimes against humanity is now understood as a national standard where when one country is observing a crime against humanity, there's an impulse to stop that based on criteria that the UN has developed. There's multinational peacekeeping forces. There's international agreements to hinder trafficking of diamonds, elephant trunks, animal skins, and humans. And importantly, there's aid to disaster victims anywhere on the planet. If you experience some type of natural disaster, there's NGOs and different organizations that will mobilize to help people around the world, which is fantastic. Compared to the past, we are extraordinarily different in terms of who we extend rights to and feel empathy for, and what global ills we encounter. Again, lots of progress. The good news is that fewer people are acting violently in societies, and our societies are attempting to contain them. However, some bad news. The reach of the violent few is much greater. We're in a world now where few individuals can have massive impacts. Charismatically violent people can inspire thousands in chat rooms, lone wolves can more readily meet, and we have types of weapons that are more effective in terms of mass murder. Looking at automatic weapons, bombs, now projectiles like cars and planes can be used to kill thousands of people by a single person. So things are improving, but that doesn't mean they're good yet. So why is that the case? Why are we seeing global improvements in terms of health and happiness of most people around the world? One indication that we have is with trade, and this is a very traditional approach to decreasing war. So with trade agreements, it is often true that where trade does not pass, that's where armies will enter. And there's this really interesting quote by Thomas Friedman who suggests that countries with McDonald's don't fight one another. It's this general concept that countries that are sufficiently stable and integrated into global markets, like having McDonald's, and are prosperous enough to keep those establishments going, are likely to conclude that the trade advantages of peace outweigh the imagined spoils of war. So it would be more beneficial to trade than to just try to conquer someone and take what they have. And this is related to the concept of cultural diffusion, which is very similar to trade. In general, which is the same as trade, can also facilitate peace. In one study with 180 countries, digital access predicted increased civil liberties. And what that resulted in is that those individuals with increased digital access were more likely to trade with their neighbors and less likely to engage in war-like activities. So this is to say that the flow of ideas happens along with goods, and both ideas and trading goods can facilitate peaceful activity amongst neighboring countries. Now let's move on to the concept of religion. Religion is often thought to be a deterrent of war, so the first question is, can religion help? Are religious people nicer than non-religious ones? And this really depends on if you are in the religious group or outside of it. We've talked so much about us versus them, and this absolutely plays into a role in terms of religion. Are religious people nicer to in-group members? There's a variety of studies that say yes. People are more likely to engage in volunteering behavior, charitable giving, spontaneous pro-sociality, more generous, trusting, honest, and forgiving in these economic games to individuals of the in-group that are also a part of their religion. There's also numerous studies that show that there is actually no effect. So what accounts for this discrepancy? The main thing is context. Similar to everything else that we've learned in this book, context absolutely matters. So there's some studies that find that you see more of this positive activity when there's a public display where someone can be observed doing a charitable act or donating at some facility. When it is observed, that's when you see people engaging in these activities more. One study with religious people found that they're more charitable, but only on their Sabbath. And this has to do with the concept of priming. We've talked a lot about priming. But when you are reminded of your religion, you're more likely to act within the understanding of what you should be doing within that religion. So on the Sabbath, that is a very salient reminder that you should be doing what your religion says you should be doing. This goes along the same lines of priming. Reminders of judgmental gods boost pro-sociality, and this is only for religions that do have these judgmental gods. Again, priming people to think of God as punitive decreases cheating. Thinking of God as forgiving increases it. And this is really just reminding them of aspects of their religion, and that influences their decisions and behaviors. Okay, now let's talk about, can religion harm? The issue with religion is in terms of harming them. As we've learned in this book, there's many physiological and neural reasons why people have good behavior towards us's and poor behavior towards them. And unfortunately, all religions around the world do distinguish between us and thems. They differ in the requirement to be an us and whether the attributes are immutable, meaning that there's some religions where you can take certain actions and be a member of that religion. There's other religions where you can't. You're either born into a family or a community, you look a certain way, or you're a member of those practices. You can't just adopt those practices and become an us. Every major religion has blood on their hands. So, look at any point throughout history and you'll find many cases of these. Here's just a small subset. Buddhist monks led the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Burma. Catholics and Protestants have been killing each other in Europe for nearly 500 years, and Shiites and Sunnis have been killing each other for over 1,300 years. Now, in one study of 600 terrorist groups spanning 40 years, the religious-based terrorism persists the longest and is least likely to subside due to fighters joining the political process. And this is important, suggesting that when there is violence, the violence that is fueled by religious beliefs tends to extend the longest and is the hardest to change when situations in the political process change. And this is an interesting behavioral study where people were surveyed at different locations in a cosmopolitan city in Europe where they were walking around the city. When people happened to be walking by a church, they expressed more conservative and negative attitudes towards non-Christians. And this has to do with priming again. When you're reminded of your religion, you have positive feelings and behaviors towards people in your group and significantly more negative behaviors and feelings towards people in your outgroup. Okay, summary here. When it comes to our best and worst behaviors, the world is astonishingly different from that of our not so distant past, which is fantastic news. We can improve very quickly. And what can help? Trade. Advantages of peace outweigh the imagined spoils of war, both in terms of trading thoughts and trading goods. For religion, this can help in-group members be nice to in-group members, but it is harmful for out-group members of a particular religion.